First of all, I would like to thank you the opportunity to participate in this conference and to be able to learn from your experiences and research. As mentioned, my name is Inês Costa. I am a doctoral student of Heritage Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of Porto's University. And today I will show you my first reflections on a topic that I have been developing parallel to my thesis, and that I choose to call Between Social Needs and Heritage Safeguard, Examples of Solidarity and Cooperation during the COVID-19 crisis. This short study is mainly devoted to the Portuguese response to the pandemic in the past year, but my intention is to keep following the events until the situation is normalized. Therefore, during this presentation, I will start with a brief reflection about heritage protection on a global scale before and during COVID-19. Afterwards, I will resume the development of the virus within the Portuguese context and present a statistical analysis of its first socio-economic impacts at a national level. I will also approach the tension between social needs and heritage safeguard and share some examples of cultural solidarity and cooperation. Finally, I will end up with a short reflection about the future of heritage, cultural institutions and professionals in Portugal. Before the pandemic, heritage held an important place within international debates, thanks to the increasing interest in the matter by governments and the public. Despite this growing awareness, the risks for cultural heritage continue to exist due to climate change, armed conflict, civil unrest, and so on. However, an international crisis can also have tremendous repercussions, not only for cultural heritage, but for the communities which revenues are directly dependent on it. Since in these situations there is less margin to help all those in need, and governments may even be forced to establish priorities like superimposing social needs to heritage safeguard. So, the COVID-19 pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization in March 2020, and from then on, the number of infections skyrocketed, resulting in lockdowns all over the world and restrictions to international movements. Businesses were temporarily shut down, and as you know, governments invested most of their funds in healthcare and social aids. Cultural institutions, sites, and professionals were also severely affected due to the suspension of activities, the reduction of income, and funding. Many were pushed to transpose their work into the digital world, so now cultural institutions and heritage sites share part of their collections and spaces with the public through virtual visits. This change resulted in the search for new methodologies of creation. It enhanced the social role of art, but also contributed to the democratization of culture, at least for those who are not eco excluded. Entering the Portuguese context, the country registered its first cases in the beginning of March 2020, and even before any governmental decision, cultural institutions progressively closed their doors. If the first wave was relatively mild, the situation got worse after the summer. Consequently, the second wave would arrive earlier than expected, reaching its peak in middle November. After a new series of confinements, the Portuguese government opened some exceptions for Christmas, but with the new year, the situation got out of control. Once again, the country shuts down and most of the population stays at home, attempting to reduce the number of infections. Beyond the health framework, the impacts of COVID-19 are starting to be equally shocking. And even if one cannot still comprehend the magnitude of the damage, there are already some indicators of a serious socioeconomic crisis. For example, according to the National Institute of Statistics, in 2019, almost 22% of the Portuguese population was at risk of poverty or social exclusion. However, with the pandemic, the situation declined even further. Following the limitations to international flights and the consequent decrease in touristic activities, Portugal registered less than 61% of guests and almost less than 75% of overnight stays. Outside the tourism sector, exports and imports decreased by 7.8, the GPN by 7.6, while unemployment rose above 7.1. Following a brutal cut in income, museum and heritage sites were forced to dismiss part of their workers, and for example, reduce their activities. In Portugal, the situation is particularly difficult for private institutions, which depend almost completely on their own profit. The significant reduction of staff that resulted from this cut in income may also mean that in the future there will be less conditions to safeguard, preserve, and study collections and sites. Another problem revealed by the pandemic was the number of people working in precarious conditions with low incomes and contractual irregularities. In fact, more than 100,000 workers, precarious workers, lost their job in 2020, and a lot of those cannot access social security. One of the reasons behind precariousness is the neoliberalization of the market, since companies are free from contracting and individuals are more exposed to all kinds of risks. According to several authors, in Portugal, liberalization resulted in the assignment of rights for subsistence, questionable hiring modes, and a lack of commitment against labor and power abuses. For that reason, most cultural professionals have no limits to working hours, are underpaid in compressed or scattered periods, and have a self-employment status that is not true. One of the most debated cases on the Portuguese media was in fact the reveal of a high number of precarious workers within the Serralves Foundation, one of the most popular contemporary art museums in the country. Facing tremendous cuts in revenues and with a gigantic infrastructure to maintain, the institution ended up dismissing several workers who found themselves with no income or access to social security. Even more shocking, though, was the case of Casa da Música, or the music house. Similarly to what happened in Serralves, the public institution was forced to temporarily dismiss some of its workers who again saw themselves without a net of support due to irregular employment status. Following the public institution's decision, workers made a protest, and as a result, the administration informed them of their permanent dispensation. Facing the high number of cultural professionals in the same situation, the government was forced to create mechanisms, such as specific allowances for artists, authors, and other cultural professionals. However, since some workers were not considered as part of the sector, they could not access that allowance. Plus, in most cases, the single amount given by the state was so little that it was only enough for someone to survive a few weeks. The insufficiency of such cultural policies, which do not offer a solution, not even in the short run, originated a series of protests, like the one organized by the Portuguese Association of Technical Services for Events that you can see in the image. Still, as we speak, thousands of people need support from local institutions to satisfy their basic needs. Considering the lack of structural measures and the future reduction of the state budget for the cultural sector, from almost 1% to less than 0.33, one must question, how can this cultural crisis be mitigated? Is the answer in a top-down, in a bottom-up, or in a mixed solution? Can solidarity and cooperation initiatives counteract some of the harmful effects of this crisis? Well, here I'm going to present you some examples of collaboration between Portuguese institutions, professionals, and communities that maybe can inspire us. The first example of solidarity that I bring you today is called the Lifeboy. It consists of a project created by a private illustration gallery from Porto called Old Galeria. During the pandemic, the gallery was forced to reduce its working hours and to close its doors during the lockdown. To survive, the administration asked its fellow artists to create or donate special illustrations for the project in order to attract customers and keep the gallery going. This is an excellent example of a bottom-up initiative, since artists are the ones who support a cultural company. Another great example is the one from Gretua. Gretua is an experimental group of theatre linked to a Portuguese university called Universidade de Aveiro. It consists of a space devoted to the performative arts, and it's mostly run by students, volunteers, and artists. During the pandemic, Gretua was equally forced to suspend its activities. However, its financial and human resources were channeled to help the community. In 2020, its members collected several computers to donate to children and teenagers so they could follow their classes during lockdowns. Plus, the association created a door-to-door campaign to shop and deliver food for those who were in mandatory confinement. Another example, Livro de Alelo is known worldwide for its architectural magnificence. The bookshop is one of the most touristic places in Porto, and its building is considered of public interest by the Portuguese law. With the sanitary crisis, the company lost most of its customers, and the administration had to weight its expenditures. And with an historical building to maintain, heritage safeguard was considered the primary duty. However, even in this framework, the bookshop found a creative way to share the community by creating a drive-through and offering thousands of books to the Portuguese readers. A powerful statement on how important culture is in overcoming periods of crisis. Known for being one of the most important art centers in Portugal, Carlos Gulbenkian's Foundation is also a major patron of cultural and artistic projects. During the pandemic, the foundation released several emergency lines to support artists, but it also launched different programs to foment cultural production and help vulnerable students to continue their studies. For example, through the Gulbenkian Plus program, which consists scholarships for university students in need. Nowadays, the Foundation continues to help the community, this time through the provision of vans to facilitate vaccination. This is another example, even if in a top-down direction, on how cultural institutions may reorganize themselves and their resources to help those in need. The Audiovisual Union was created during the pandemic to help workers from the sector who found themselves with no job or social support. Its main goal is the recollection and distribution of food exclusively to the audiovisual workers. The union already counts with 8 help centers spread along the country, and its motto is to leave no one behind. To promote the donation and collection of food, the union organized several solidarity concerts involving some well-known Portuguese bands such as Dead Combo or the legendary Tiger Man. This is a very interesting initiative since it can be considered a mixed solution, meaning that we can find several layers of solidarity both in a top-down and in a bottom-up direction. In this case, for example, the first form of solidarity is the creation of the union itself by members of the civil society. Afterwards, there is a collaboration between artists and bands which perform to attract donations. And finally, there are the spectators who simultaneously give money for the bands and bags of food for the union. Considering the previous premises, one must question, what future is there for cultural heritage, artistic institutions, and professionals in Portugal? Pondering the lack of investment, the high number of precarious workers, and the institutionalized dependency on foreign tourism, how can cultural organizations and heritage sites survive in a post-pandemic country? Well, we think that the answer is probably in a mixed solution. In terms of cultural heritage, the country may need to reconsider its high dependence on foreign tourism and look for alternative solutions to guarantee that the economic sustainability of its sites. One of the possibilities is to start investing in national tourism, which can also contribute to reapproach the Portuguese public to its own heritage. Since the state budget for culture is increasingly low, heritage sites may also need to start making a prismatic use of their spaces. Unfortunately, if proper funding is not guaranteed in the next years, this may lead to a lack of resources to preserve, manage, and study cultural sites. In the long run, though, the lack of funding in public institutions and in private ones will always result in precariousness and instability for its workers. In this case, a truthful commitment by the Portuguese government in resolving the legal gaps inside the cultural framework is necessary and emergent. By giving cultural workers access to social support, allowing them to have a contributory career, and considering the implementation of intermittent work status, some of the current social problems can be mitigated. This also means that the state must guarantee that cultural institutions contribute to the protection of their workers by giving them a fair payment and a legitimate contract. And in cases of non-compliance, workers must be protected and perpetrators brought to justice. In a policy from below, artists and cultural professionals must cooperate to surpass this crisis. This can imply actions of solidarity, as I showed you, but it can also mean that in cases of exploitation or irregularities, the complaints from precarious workers must not be censored by those who have a formal position within an institution. This because we know that inside the same organization, you can have several layers when it comes to respecting labor rights. Finally, there is an urgent necessity to reconsider the role of cultural and heritage in education, development, and in the creation of a more inclusive, empathetic, and collaborative society. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to respond to your questions at the end of this session. Thank you.